The Trolloc Wars had ended, leaving the eastern and central Westlands in ruins. The occupation of these lands by the invaders contributed to the destruction of almost everything that humanity had created over the last 1,000 years. The kingdoms of the western and southern Westlands survived the greatest turmoil since the War of the Power, but they also fell under the weight of other problems that arose during the conflict in the following years. Despite this, humanity would once again rise from its knees, raising its civilization from ruins, culminating in an event not seen in history since the previous age. In today's episode, we will tell the stories of false dragons and the story of a certain King Arthur and his journey from the ruler of a small kingdom to immortal glory and conflict with the Women of the White Tower. These adventures have been inspiring fantasy fans for years, and as you know, the realm of adventures is the realm of Dungeons & Dragons. That's why this video is sponsored by the biggest D&D campaign ever created, Curse of the Usurper. This is a 3-volume set of campaign books totaling over 1,000 pages, bringing you an epic adventure for D&D 5th edition, and you really get everything in this set: more than 60 maps, 50 new items, 100 monsters and NPCs, 20 fleshed out stores, puzzles, brawls and challenges in the main city of Havdir, and long adventures through the lands of vampires and giants, a terrible asylum and frozen darklands, with perhaps a chance of reaching the lost mine, the lair of the Usurper. The campaign features QR codes to trigger music and voiceover lines as you go along, and various miniatures are offered to enhance the experience further. You can get a custom GM screen, custom dice, and pre-made characters with all the relevant sheets ready to use right away. It is a seriously complete D&D package, and you can get it by pledging to their Kickstarter. All pledges get you free access to a shard virtual tabletop version of Curse of the Usurper, so you can play it online as well. So go get this massive adventure at the Kickstarter linked in the description. During the 300 years of fighting against the Shadowspawn, much of the Westland was engulfed in hostilities. The nations in the central and eastern regions could not withstand the pressure of the enemy. In contrast, the nations in the west were so weakened that they could not cope with the problems that arose after the final expulsion of the blighted enemy. This led to the disintegration of Aelgar, Sappho, Aharon, Jaramide, and Esenia's nations. New states began forming in the devastated areas in the following years. The only area that escaped serious problems was Tar Valon, managed from the White Tower by Aes Sedai. When the period of disintegration of the old and the creation of new states ended, 29 new nations were formed in the Westland, which began to fight among themselves, just like the 10 nations after the breaking of the world. However, they were able to join forces in combat, responding to the White Tower's call to counter the threat from false dragons. The false dragons phenomenon was based on a series of predictions written in the language used during the Age of Legends, known as the Old Tongue. These prophecies were called Prophecies of the Dragon, or the Karathon Cycle. The predictions, which became quite difficult to interpret after the Trolloc Wars, discussed the circumstances in which the Dragon Reborn would appear. However, since few people could comprehend these ancient texts in their entirety, it was possible for individuals to erroneously conclude that they were the Dragon Reborn based on a partial understanding of the prophecy. The White Tower considered such persons to be false dragons, who had to be brought to Tar Valon so that they would not pose a threat to the world. Most often, false dragons were men who had discovered the ability to channel one power, whom the Aes Sedai of the Red Ajah had failed to detect and gentle. The first known red dragon was Rowlin Darksbane, who operated in the 4th century after breaking. The next was Urien Stonebow, who proclaimed himself the Dragon Reborn in 1301 AB, the same year that the decisive course of the Trolloc Wars took place, the Battle of Mycande. After 7 years, he was captured and gentled, dying shortly thereafter. Another known false dragon that appeared after the Trolloc Wars during the Free Years or FY period was a man called Davian, of whom nothing else is known. However, the next false dragon after him would leave his mark on the entire Westland, causing great change, not only for the region, but for the whole world. The year 939 FY was the beginning of a period of great changes, most of which were not for the better. An epidemic struck the Westland, later known as Black Fever. As the disease spread across the region, hitting all nearby nations and killing about 10% of the entire population, in Damavand, a country bordering the Arith Ocean, a man named Gwer Amalasan, who could channel one power, declared himself to be the Dragon Reborn. Amalasan began gathering supporters fairly quickly, while Damavand and the surrounding countries, still plagued by the plague, could not oppose the army that the false dragon gathered. By taking advantage of the pandemic, Gwer Amalasan seized a foothold of power, with the intention of unifying the Westland under his banner. At the call of the Amelin seat, currently occupied by Bonwyn Maragdin of the Red Ajah, the surrounding nations gathered to capture the false dragon. Amalasan, meanwhile, went on the offensive, capturing Elendapur and Belusun, the countries south of Damavand, thus starting the War of the Second Dragon. He then continued his advance south and also launched a campaign in the east, occupying Karendor, Daulan, Farashel and Shiota, considered one of the Westland's most powerful states. Knowing the Karathan cycle fairly well, Gwer Amalasan knew that if he captured a fortress known as the Stone of Tyr, he would give a clear and distinct signal to the rest of the nations that he was the true Dragon Reborn. Moving his army eastwards to the country called Morena, where the fortress was located, he subjugated the kingdoms of Nerevan and Isandara. Despite having a huge number of warriors, the false dragon failed to break through the fortress's defences, which were supported by 39 Aes Sedai, and was forced to begin a long, protracted siege to take the stone. With an enormous number of armed followers, Amalasan directed a portion of his troops northward, attacking the Talmor and Kodamar nations. In the 4th year after its proclamation, in 943 FY, nearly 1/3 of the Westland was under the control of the false dragon, and its People of the Dragon. Many nations fighting against Amalasan began to plunge into protests and riots. Among them were remote nations such as Masenashar, Dal Kalain, and the mighty Aldashar. Many Westlanders began to consider Gwer to be the de facto reborn dragon, because surely no false dragon could achieve this much in such a relatively short time. Many nations and rulers still resisted Amalasan. One of them was the Kingdom of Shandal, ruled by Arthur Paindrag Tanriel. Arthur had been on the throne of his nation since his parents, Midin Paindrag Megor and Mylind Paindrag Lindhal, died from Black Fever. The young, only 31-year-old ruler managed to gain the nickname Hawkwing due to the speed with which the troops under his command moved. In the spring of 943 FY, Hawkwing moved at the head of an army of 35,000 to support the Kingdom of Kodamar against the false dragon. Heading there from the Kingdom of Tova, he crossed the Maraside Mountains, stretching from the Spine of the World in the east to the Arenin River in the west. The only way that he would ensure the smooth march of his troops was the Jolvine Pass. Leading 23,000 infantry and 12,000 horsemen, supported by Tar Valon troops, probably protecting the unknown number of Aes Sedai accompanying Paindrag, Hawkwing immediately stumbled beyond the pass, where he crashed headlong into an Amalasan army of some 57,000 warriors. This army was led by the false dragon himself, who wished to cross the mountains to cut off Kodamar from any reinforcements. Recognizing that the wooded area at the foot of the Maraside Mountains was poor terrain for his 26,000 cavalry, Amalasan dismounted most of them. As the battle began, it went as the false dragon intended, who, using his numbers, sought to encircle the enemy forces, but King Arthur's quick reaction prevented complete encirclement and disaster. At the end of the day, the fighting was stopped. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but Amalasan still seemed to be on top. The end of the day did not mean the end of the battle. The false dragon decided to wait out the night, and in the dawn follow Hawkwing, who began to retreat towards the pass. Paindrag's rearguard skirmishes with Gwer's recon troops continued throughout the night, reporting that troops were indeed returning to the pass. The false dragon did not expect Arthur Hawkwing to attack him. Under cover of night, the Hawkwing's rearguard was to simulate covering the retreat, while the rest of the troops were ordered to encircle the weary but still more numerous troops of the dragon. Contrary to the military doctrine of the time, the Shandal ruler divided his army into 3 parts to bypass the forces of the False Dragon from the east and west. In the morning, Amalasuan's army was ready to move north in pursuit of Hawkwings, but unexpectedly, from the east and west, Paindrag's infantry attacked Gware's troops, who managed to rally his men and resist. Despite the fierce resolve of both sides, the scales of victory finally tipped in Hawkwing's favour, as his cavalry struck from the south, bursting deep into the Dragon People's ranks. Their aim, and the purpose of the accompanying Aes Sedai, was not to complete the encirclement and break enemy troops, but to capture the False Dragon. As the cavalry, with the help of the women of the White Tower, accomplished their task, Amalasuan's troops collapsed and rushed to flee when word spread of their captain's capture. After the Battle of Julvine Pass was over, Hawkwing's army moved north, guarding the Aes Sedai, who were transporting the False Dragon to the White Tower. Paindrag stopped with his army only a few miles ahead of Tar Valon, thus breaking the tower's law, which forbade entry into areas controlled by the Amyrlin Seat with more than 20 soldiers. Nevertheless, the Aes Sedai were grateful for the delivery of the False Dragon, though the gratitude they showed the victorious king was quite chilly. The Amyrlin Seat gave Arthur's troops 5 days to rest, after which they were coldly ordered to leave the White Tower territory. Hawkwing's army moved south after the appointed days, returning to the Kingdom of Shandal. Amalasuan's imprisonment in the White Tower was not the end of the conflict. Located in Kodamar, the 50,000-strong army under the command of Samhain Macohine, an experienced cavalry commander, marched towards Tar Valon with one goal in mind: to retrieve their supposed saviour from the hands of the Aes Sedai. On the way, they joined a larger army, led by Alinda Methenius, who was a renegade Aes Sedai experienced in the art of siege. The appearance of over 100,000 people under the city walls was a complete surprise for all Aes Sedai. Using their momentum, an army loyal to Amalasuan managed to capture 2 bridges over the Arenin River, as well as the White Tower itself. The victor from the Julvine Pass set out to save the city, entering it from the opposite side of the Dragon People. A brutal battle engulfed the streets of Tar Valon, killing 40,000 of Amalasuan's followers and both of their commanders. The fight would probably have continued without news of the False Dragon's trial and his gentling. Gware's surviving supporters either escaped or were taken prisoner. The Battle of Tar Valon became the final chord of the War of the Second Dragon. The appearance of Arthur Hawkwing's army in Tar Valon is shrouded in mystery. Sources unrelated to the White Tower said that Paindrag found out about the attack and wanted to relieve the city, receiving permission from Aes Sedai to enter with his army, or even that the sorceresses had asked him for help. In turn, the records of the White Tower indicate that the ruler of Shandal broke the law again, entering without Amyrlin Seat's consent. In the early summer of 943 FY, the tensions between the Shandal and Tar Valon grew deeper, with the Amyrlin Seat resenting Hawkwing for such a blatant and brazen breach of the law of the White Tower. Her anger was further fueled by the news that most of the lands previously under Amalasuan's control saw Hawkwing as the ideal candidate for ruler of these kingdoms, and considered him to be the saviour of the Aes Sedai. A few weeks later, a coordinated attack from neighbouring nations rained down on Shandal. Queen Nessaline of Cainbarin attacked from the west, King Tephen of Kodamar from the southeast, and the first Chancellor Almindra of Tova attacked from the east. It was not the first such attack in Shandal's history, but each time before that, arbitration by Aes Sedai resulted in the conclusion of peace. This time Tar Valon was left deaf to calls. The lonely Kingdom of Shandal launched a desperate defense against the invaders, who cited Paindrag's supposed aggressive imperialism as their casus belli. Veterans of the War of the Second Dragon, as well as ordinary people, flocked to the ranks of the undefeated Hawkwing, who not only defended his kingdom, but also took West Torva and the northern lands of Kodamar by the winter of 943 FY. The following year, Alind, Talmor and Aldashar joined the aggression against the Shandal, but this was still not enough to overcome Arthur Paindrag, who, despite fighting a defensive war, had by the end of the year completely taken the territories of his original 3 enemies. For the next 19 years, the false dragon suppressor fought the nations that declared war on his kingdom one after the other, using a policy of defensive expansionism. The only country that joined him instead of fighting against Hawkwing was Morena. The last nation to surrender to Paindrag was Aldashar. Its ruler, Jol Ramadar, surrendered to the King of Shandal in the spring of 963 FY. The remaining nations that remained neutral joined under the pressure of their citizens, or because of a rebellion of the nobles, who saw better prospects for themselves in the new empire. The territories that were subordinate to Amalasan were plunged into chaos after the War of the Second Dragon, where Gwer's former underlings began carving their own nations for themselves, so the ever-growing Hawkwing army had no trouble occupying these territories, especially since a large part of the population of these areas were fed up with war, or just saw Arthur as their rightful king. With the subjugation of the Kingdom of Aldashar, the period known as the War of Consolidation ended, with King Arthur Paindrag Tanriol of Shandal leading a new empire as the High King. His kingdom stretched from the Mountains of Doom in the north to the Sea of Storms in the south, and from the Spine of the World in the east to the Arith Ocean in the west. The only relatively independent area outside of his domain was Tar Valon. After many years of feuds that contributed to the empire's creation, Hawkwing achieved an accord with the Amelin Seat, allowing Aes Sedai to be stewards of some provinces and serve in advisory functions to the steward in others. He even accepted Cherwin Sao from Green Ajar as his personal advisor. As peace reigned in Westland after nearly 23 years of war, the Great King faced a challenging task. This was the first time anyone had governed such a large area since the breaking of the world. Knowing he could not cope with it alone, he divided his empire into smaller provinces, which were entrusted to administrators loyal to him. These provincial boundaries often ran differently from the frontiers of the old states. Moreover, both the governors and the army of a given province were not from that region. For example, the province of the former Kingdom of Kodamar and Tova was governed by a person who might have come from the Darmavan of the Arith Ocean. This was to prevent possible uprisings and a mass collapse of the empire. Despite this, throughout Hawkwing's reign, there were 9 rebellions in his empire, none of which gained wider popular support. In the territory of the empire, beyond the army, the peace was also kept by the Civil Guard. This was a kind of police force, keeping the law in towns and villages, and patrolling the highways, keeping the land clean of bandits and other vagabonds. Knowing the importance of fair governance, Arthur Hawkwing reformed the judicial system. He created many schools, training judges and attorneys, who took office for 6 years in a given area, after which they could assume the same office for the same period, but in a different part of the empire. Moreover, they were subjected to adherence to a strict ethical code. Persons accused of given crimes could appeal to higher courts, the highest of which was the Great King. If the accused was found guilty, instead of being sent to prison, he was sentenced to work, which would benefit the society he wanted to cause harm. Hawkwing's reign was not peaceful, especially in the early days. During the consolidation in 955 FY, his firstborn son, Moder, was killed in battle, and 2 years later his wife, Ameline Tagora, Moder's twin sister Amira, and 2 other children were poisoned. 961 FY was the first year of the period known as the Years of the Silent Rage, during which the Great King searched for his family's killers. In 964, a year after the reunification of the Westland, the most eminent commander of the period, at the head of his army, headed east across the Ridge of the World to the Isle Waste, intending to subjugate the Isle clans living there. These desert warrior clans avoided open confrontation with Hawkwing's great army, and instead waged guerrilla warfare, raiding smaller units and disrupting supply lines. With the increasing threat of defeat and destruction of his troops, Paindrag withdrew back to the Westland. Returning from the Isle Waste, the High King met a woman named Tamika, 30 years his junior, whom he married in 965 FY. It made his domestic politics softer, thus ending the years of silent rage and bringing the Westland into a time of peace and development. However, this peace didn't last long. In the year 967 FY, a man named Jalwin Morad appeared at the court of the Great King. Despite the disapproval of Queen Tamika, Morad became the king's most important advisor, urging Hawkwing to step back from his policy of cooperation with the White Tower. The first step on this path was the decree of 974 FY, confiscating the positions of all Aes Sedai in the Empire. A year later, a bounty was placed on the head of every Aes Sedai who did not support the king against the White Tower. That same year, Hawkwing sent his commanders to the territories of the White Tower. The army of the Empire seized all the lands surrounding Tar Valon before laying siege to the city itself. Unfortunately for the Great King, many people in the Empire, including nobles, favoured the White Tower, sending various goods to the besieged city, as well as sabotaging military operations, which caused the siege to drag out for over 20 years. Due to Morad's whispers, Arthur Paindrag became somewhat obsessed with the Aes Sedai, claiming that they were behind the nation's conspiracy against Shandal just after the Second Dragon War, that they were to blame for his family's death in 961 FY, and that they wanted to strengthen their position in the Westland at his expense. None of his theories, however, could be supported by evidence. A far more credible threat to Hawkwing's sovereignty was the Trolloc invasion of 986 and 987. The Shadowspawn attacked at the end of the year, stopping at the defences of the borderlands and threatening to break through the fortifications at any moment. In 987, when the army was assembled, efforts were made to avert the danger. The Great King's plan was to push the enemy deeper into the Empire, south and east of the borderland, to cut the enemy off from the Trolloc's native lands, and to force them into a corner where the Shadowspawn would be utterly destroyed. As a result of this campaign, 7 battles were fought, resulting in the Trollocs moving toward the direction Hawkwing intended. The decisive clash occurred on the Talidar Plain in the former Kingdom of Hamaria, just south of the borders of Shiina Province. The course of the clash is unknown, but the Blight's army suffered such a severe defeat that for the next 50 years, the borderland enjoyed uninterrupted peace. On the site of the battleground, the Great King raised a monument to remind future generations of the glorious and greatest victory against the Dark One forces since the Battle of Maikande. The names of all those who died defending humanity were engraved on this monument. The king's happiness, however, did not last long. In the fall of the same year, Hawkwing's wife Tamika died under mysterious circumstances, but this time the elderly ruler did not launch a campaign of terror to expose her supposed killers. Another decision that influenced the shape of the world after that was the dispatch of 2 expeditionary armies in 992 FY, one to the west of Westland, the other to the east. An expedition of approximately 200 ships and 300,000 warriors and settlers was sent west under the command of Arthur's son, Luthair Paindrag Mondwyn. They were to travel across the Ocean of Arith to the lands later called Seanchan. An expedition of similar size, led by one of Arthur's daughters, was to go across the Sea of Storms east of the land of Shara, beyond the Isle Wasteland. However, contact with both flotillas was lost fairly quickly. These doomed voyages were likely the machinations of the shady advisor Jalwin Morad. In 994 FY, the 82-year-old king fell ill, but refused to heal at the hands of Aes Sedai, leading to his death shortly after that. It left behind a huge country which, despite its size, functioned quite efficiently. The only issue that remained unaddressed at the time of the monarch's death, as you can guess, was the question of succession. His legal heirs were Marithiel Camelain, Norodrim Nosakawa, and Elfraid Guitama, who were ready and able to take the reins of a huge state. However, within days of Hawkwing's death, Marithiel was murdered, Norodrim was killed in battle, and the fate of Elfraid remained unknown. The only factor linking the deaths of these characters was the king's advisor, who worked with each of them in turn. You could call it a coincidence, but throughout his time at court, Jalwin Morad did not age a bit, and after 40 years of his presence, he disappeared as if he did not exist at all. Years later, he turned out to be another incarnation of Ishamael, who had returned after 1,000 years and contributed to the Empire's weakening in preparation for its collapse. With the death of the Great King and potential pretenders, Arthur Hawkwing's empire fractured, plunging the Westland into chaos for over a century. The states built on the empire's ruins sought to erase any trace of the existence of the unifier and its state. All records of the monarch's achievements have been destroyed. Even the monument standing in a glorious place for humanity on the plain of Talidar has been ruined. Humanity in the Westland returned to the point it was at the turn of the age, nearly 1,000 years earlier, but the end of one era turned out to be the beginning of another. More videos on the Wheel of Time series are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we will catch you on the next one.